The tide came in wrong that night. I had sailed the northern passages a dozen times. I knew what the sea sounded like when it was honest, and I knew what it sounded like when it was hiding something. The water off Thavern's harbor had that second quality, flat and too quiet, the kind of silence that sits in a man's chest like a held breath. My escort was gone. 3 men who had ridden with me for 11 years, and the hunters who had been on our trail since the Aldenmere crossing had taken all 3 before we ever sighted the coast. I came in alone on a salvaged tender, one hand on the tiller and the other pressed against my ribs where an edge had found me, not deep, but persistent and cold. The harbor lights of Thavern were distant smears in the sea fog. A king does not advertise his wounds, so I straightened my back and thought about nothing except the dock. I did not make it to the dock cleanly. The tender caught a cross-current near the breakwater, and for one undignified moment I went sideways into the shallows, saltwater finding every place the wound had not already reached. I got my feet under me in 4 feet of cold harbor water and stood there in the fog, dripping, trying to decide whether what I felt was pain or simply indignation. "You're going to bleed out if you stand there much longer." The voice came from the breakwater, a woman's voice, low and matter-of-fact, the way you'd speak to a horse that had gotten its leg caught in a fence. No alarm in it, no particular reverence either. I looked up and found her crouched at the water's edge in the gray light, a salvage lantern in one hand, watching me the way a practical person watches a problem they've already decided to solve. She was not dressed for company. Her hair was loose from its braid, darkened by the sea mist at the edges, and her clothes were the kind worn by someone who expected to end the evening wet. She had the look of the harbor about her, salt-weathered, economical, capable in her hands. Her eyes were steady. She did not look particularly impressed by me, which was, I would come to understand, entirely characteristic. "Come out of the water," she said, as if she said it regularly to strangers. I did not know her name yet. I did not know that the coastal wolves of Thavern, who had refused every alpha and every court emissary for 300 years of recorded history, had spent the last 11 nights drifting to the door of her harbor keep like Tydrak. I did not know what that meant, or what she was, or what the old moon tide had been building toward in the long years before I ever set eyes on her face. I only knew that the water was cold, that I was losing blood, and that the woman on the breakwater had the most unanswerable eyes I had ever looked into. I came out of the water. Her name was Saoirse, and the harbor keep belonged to her by default. Her father's debts had taken everything else, and the keep was the one piece of Thavern's coast too salty and inconvenient to be worth collecting. She ran it alone, which she managed by being more capable than anyone who might have thought to challenge her about it. She did not ask my name. She sat me down in the keep's main room, stone floor, salvage timber ceiling, a fire that meant business, and cut away enough of my traveling coat to see the wound, and then she pressed clean cloth against it with steady hands and told me to hold it there while she found the thread. "Hunters," she said, not looking up from the cabinet she was searching. "Yes. How many are still behind you?" I considered the question. The honest answer was that I did not know the men who had taken my escort were professionals, and professionals did not always show their full count. "Enough," I said. She found the thread. She came back and sat across from me and began to close the wound with the same quiet competence with which she seemed to approach everything, and I watched her face while she worked. She was concentrating. There was no trace of fear in her, not of the wound, not of the situation, not of me. A stranger had come out of the harbor in the dark with a blade mark in his ribs and an unknown number of men behind him, and she was simply solving the immediate problem. "You'll need to stay off that for 3 days," she said when she finished. "After that, I can't speak to it. I can't stay 3 days. Then you'll reopen it and bleed somewhere inconvenient, and that will be your business." She stood and washed her hands in the basin by the fire. "The loft is dry, the ladder's on the east side. Don't use the lantern up there, the shutters are old and the light shows." She went back to whatever she had been doing before the harbor threw me at her feet, and I sat in the light of the fire and tried to understand what manner of woman simply did this. Sheltered a bleeding stranger in the fog without asking why, without a flicker of calculation in her eyes, without anything in her face except the practical intention to keep him from dying on her breakwater. The coastal wolves found their way in some time after midnight. I heard them before I saw them, the soft weight of paws on the stone floor below, and then the particular quiet that meant a pack had settled rather than passing through. I came to the edge of the loft and looked down, and there were 4 of them arranged around the fire as if they had always lived there. Gray-coated, heavy-shouldered, each of them carrying the mark of the old moontide in the pale ring around their eyes. The harbor wolves of Thavern. I had read about them. Every student of the Northern Kingdoms had. They had not acknowledged an Alpha King's presence in this territory for 3 centuries. They had walked through the court of my grandfather without so much as turning their heads. Saoirse was sitting in the chair beside the fire with her mending, and the largest of them had its head in her lap. She was not looking at it with wonder. She was mending, and the wolf had its head in her lap, and this appeared to be a thing that simply happened. My wolf, the part of me that lives beneath the king's bearing, that knows things before my mind has caught up, went completely quiet. Not still in the cautious way. Still in the way of a man who has just walked into a room and realized that everything he thought he understood about the shape of his life was only preliminary. I did not understand what I was looking at yet, but something in me did. 3 days as it happened. Not because I conceded the point. A king of Cadrin's line does not concede points to harbor keepers, regardless of how unanswerable their eyes may be. But because on the morning of the 2nd day I tried the ladder and the wound reminded me, with considerable firmness, that Saoirse had been correct. I went back up. She brought food without comment. She left water and clean cloth. She did not hover. She did not treat me as a curiosity or a prize or a danger or anything except a logistical problem she was managing adequately. And I found this simultaneously maddening and more restful than anything I had experienced in the 17 years since my father had put the crown on my head. No one had treated me like a logistical problem since I was 6 years old. The coastal wolves came and went. 3 of them remained in the keep almost continuously. The largest one, Saoirse called him by no name, only a particular quality of attention that he clearly understood, was beside her whenever she moved through the keep. Once, from the loft, I watched him track her path from the fire to the door and back with the steady focus that wolves reserve for their own. The kind of watching that is not protective so much as it is claiming. I knew that watching. I had been told all my life that I would recognize it when I finally felt it myself. I was beginning to understand what I was looking at. On the morning of the 3rd day, she came up to the loft with bread and salt fish, and sat on the chest by the small window while I ate. And for the first time she looked at me with something more deliberate than her ordinary practical attention. "You're someone important," she said. It was not a question. "What makes you say that?" "The way you hold yourself when you're not in pain. And the wolves." She looked at the large one, who had followed her up the ladder with an agility surprising for his size, and was currently arranged by the window in a patch of gray morning light. "They've never done this for anyone, not in my lifetime, and my father told me not in his." "What do they do for you?" I asked. She considered this as if it were a strange question. "They're just here," she said. "They have been since I was small. They come when the weather turns bad, mostly, and sometimes in the middle of the night when nothing's wrong at all as far as I can tell." She paused. "My father thought it was because I fed them, but I've tried not feeding them and they still came." 300 years of the harbor wolves refusing every crown in the Northern Kingdoms, and they had been sleeping on this woman's floor since she was a child. I set down the bread. "Saoirse," I said, "I need to tell you something." "You don't have to," she said. "I don't need to know who you are to want you to live." That stopped me entirely. She said it without sentiment, the same flat practicality she brought to everything. But under it was something that was not practical at all, and we both knew it. She looked at the wolf by the window and not at me, and the tips of her ears were red, and she was entirely too composed for how red they were. "Nevertheless," I said, "my name is Cadrin. I am the Alpha King of the Northern Hold of Veldris. I came to Thavern to negotiate a wartime pact with your coastal council, and my escort was taken before we reached shore. I should have been at the council hall 2 days ago." She absorbed this. The red at her ears did not diminish, but neither did anything else about her change. She looked at me directly, unhurried, the way she had looked at me on the breakwater, and then she said, "Will they come for you here?" "Yes, by tomorrow morning at the latest." She nodded once as if this were simply the next problem. "Then we move you tonight," she said. We nearly made it. The meeting point was a salt house on the eastern edge of the harbor, 3/4 of a mile from the keep along a path that ran behind the breakwater, exposed for the last 100 yards before it dipped back toward the stone buildings of the inner harbor. I had sent word through a channel I trusted, and my council should have had men waiting. The plan was sound. The problem was the informant I had not known about, the one who had sold my arrival time, and the route I would take to the hunters who had been waiting in Thavern for exactly this. We came around the last bend in the path, and I felt it before I saw it, the particular wrongness in the air that a man who has survived long enough learns to read like weather. I put my hand out and stopped Saoirse without thinking, and she stopped instantly, reading my stillness. "How many?" she said, barely a breath. I was counting shadows at the far end of the path. 5, possibly 6. She was quiet for a moment. "The salt house has a side door if we go back and take the long way around the... They'll move the moment they know we've seen them. We have about 30 seconds before." The first man stepped out of the shadows, and I recognized the mark on his shoulder. Not hunters for hire. These were Veldris courtmen, my own courtmen. The faction that had been arranging my removal for the better part of 2 years, that had taken my escort not because they were in the pay of a foreign power, but because they were in the pay of my own council's most dangerous element, and this crossing had been the perfect opportunity. I had been sold not by a stranger, but by a man I had known since I was 12 years old. There is a particular cold that comes with that understanding. It is not the cold of fear. It is the cold of recalibration, of every assumption you have been moving through the world with shifting suddenly to account for the new shape of things. I felt it move through me, and then I set it aside, because there were 5 armed men at the end of the path, and I had 1 working arm and no escort, and whatever I was going to do about the council's faction would have to wait until I was not being assassinated. "Stay behind me," I said to Saoirse. "I know this path better than you do," she said. "If we..." The arrow came from the left, from the breakwater side, where a 6th man had been waiting in a position I had not caught. It was aimed at my throat. It was a good shot, precisely measured from a man who knew his trade. Saoirse stepped into it. She moved before I did. I will carry that for the rest of my life, that she was faster. Not trained faster, not strategic, not calculated. She simply moved, the way a person moves when there is no time to think and the body does what it does. She stepped into the arrow's path and it took her in the left shoulder, and the sound it made is not something I can describe to you with any justice, because the moment it made that sound, every coastal wolf in Thavern's harbor came off the breakwater. They did not come quietly. 40 wolves, by the count I was given later. The harbor pack of Thavern, which had not answered any alpha's call in living memory. They came off the stones and over the path wall and out of the fog like a tide reversing, and in the space of perhaps 10 seconds, the 5 men at the end of the path and the archer on the breakwater were no longer a threat by any measure. I was already beside her. The arrow had gone through the shoulder cleanly, past bone, past everything important, lodged in the muscle of her upper back. Not a killing shot as it struck her. It would have been a killing shot as it struck me. She had taken it in the shoulder so that it would not take me in the throat, and she had done this for a man whose name she had not known 3 days ago. And she was on one knee on the path with her hand braced against the stones and the blood running dark through her fingers. And she was, even now, even bleeding on the harbor path in the middle of what should have been a crisis, trying not to make too much of it. "It's through," she said, slightly breathless. That's good, I think." "Don't talk," I said. "I'm just saying it's not as bad as..." "Saoirse," I had her by the shoulders, gently, desperately gently, and I was looking at her face, and I could not look away from her face, and I understood in that moment with a clarity that did not require any further evidence why the harbor wolves had been sleeping on her floor since she was a child. "Stop talking and let me carry you." She looked at me. Her face was pale and very steady, the way her face was always steady, and she said, "You have a wound in your ribs." "I am aware of that. You should not be carrying." "I am carrying you," I said, "and I am not asking your opinion on the matter." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said, and she said it in the way she said everything, simply, without fuss. And I gathered her up off the cold stones and carried her, and my ribs told me exactly what they thought about this, and I did not listen to them at all. The mate mark burned into my palm as I lifted her. I had been told about the mate mark since boyhood, the old blood sign, the mark of the destined bond, burned into the palm at the moment of recognition. I had been told it felt like nothing so much as a brand applied from the inside. I had spent 17 years waiting for it and finding nothing, and standing before every woman my counsel brought me, and feeling only the polite absence of anything destined. It did not feel like a brand. It felt like something I had been cold, without for a very long time, finally becoming warm. I looked at my palm as I carried her. The mark was there, dark as old ink, the pattern of the moontide knot that the harbor wolves bore in the pale ring around their eyes. I looked at it, and I looked at her face against my shoulder, and the 40 coastal wolves fell in around us on the path, and I walked through the sea fog toward the salt house with everything that I thought I had known about the shape of my life rearranging itself quietly around a new center. My council arrived at Thavern by the following evening, the loyal faction riding hard from the north once my word reached them. They brought a physician. They brought, at my specific instruction, chains for the men on the path who had survived the harbor wolves' accounting, and a message for the faction member who had sold the route. That his Alpha King was alive, that he was fully informed, and that the reckoning would be thorough. Saoirse was not aware of most of this. She was in the harbor keep's main room with the physician and the wolves and a level of bed rest she was submitting to with barely contained impatience, and I sat outside the door for most of that night because I found that I could not be very far from her. This was a new experience for me. I had always been very comfortable with distance. She woke in the early hours of the morning. I heard her from outside the door, heard the shift of her breathing, and I came in and sat in the chair by the fire that the large coastal wolf had abandoned with visible reluctance. She looked at me in the low firelight for a long moment. "You're still here," she said. "Yes." She seemed to think about this. "The men on the path." "Managed." "And your counsel?" "Here, all of it managed." I looked at her. "How are you?" "Annoyed," she said. "I can't use my left arm properly, and I have a great deal of mending that isn't getting done." I sat with this for a moment. "Saoirse," I said, "may I show you something?" She nodded, wary. I held out my palm. In the low light of the fire, the mate mark was clear, dark, and intricate, the moontide knot exactly matching the pale ring the harbor wolves wore. I watched her look at it. I watched the recognition move through her face. She was a harbor girl in a saltstone keep in Thavern, but she had grown up with the coastal wolves, and she knew the old signs when she saw them. Her father had taught her that much. "That's the moontide mark," she said. "Yes." "That's—" She stopped, looked at it again, looked at the wolves arranged around the fire, looked at the large one who lifted his head and regarded her steadily. "That's the same pattern." "Yes." "What does it mean?" she asked. She knew. I could see that she knew. She was asking because she needed to hear it said plainly, and this was, I had come to understand, entirely characteristic of her. Saoirse of the harbor keep did not deal in implication when plain words would serve. "It means," I said, "that the bond between us is destined, that you are my fated mate, that the coastal wolves have been keeping you for this, for 300 years they have kept themselves for this, and the mark burned into my hand the moment I lifted you off the path." I paused. "It also means that you have a choice, and that I will not press it, and that whatever you decide will be honored absolutely and without condition." She was very quiet. The fire settled. One of the wolves shifted, rested its chin on its paws. "You keep saying that," she said finally. "That I have a choice." "Because you do. Most kings I've heard of don't." She stopped, reconsidered. "I haven't heard of many kings." "Most kings," I said, "are fools about this. I have no interest in being a fool about this." She looked at my palm again, at the mark that the firelight made very clear. She looked at her own hand, the unbandaged one, her right, and she turned it over slowly, and there on her palm, fainter but unmistakable, was the same pattern beginning to resolve. I had not seen it before. The physician had not mentioned it. But the moontide moved at its own pace and in its own time, and it had been moving toward this for a very long time. She stared at it. "Oh," she said quietly. "Yes," I said. She was still for another moment, very still, the way she was still when she was thinking through a logistical problem, applying the same steady consideration to this that she applied to everything. I waited. I had nowhere else to be. There was nowhere else in any accounting of where I should be that was more important than this chair, this fire, this woman thinking carefully about the rest of her life. "I would need to know," she said at last, "that the harbor keep is looked after. It's been in my family since before my father's time, and there are people along this coast who depend on it." I blinked. Of all the things I had expected. That is, I said carefully, an extremely manageable concern. And the wolves come with me, obviously. Obviously. And I would need, she stopped, looked at me. I don't know what a Wataluna needs, I don't know any of this. I know what a king needs, I said. I have 17 years of experience in that. What I need is someone who tells me the truth without regard for my rank, keeps her head in a crisis, and steps into arrows aimed at my throat without waiting to be asked. I am aware that this is a strange list of requirements. She looked at me for a long moment. That's not strange, she said. That's just being useful. You were more than useful, I said. You were, I stopped. I am not, by nature or by practice, a man who says the next thing easily. I have a court full of people who say things well, and I have spent 17 years listening to all of them, and none of what they say to me sounds like the things I want to say in this room, in this chair, to this woman with the salt in her hair and the harbor wolves at her feet. You gave me your shoulder instead of my throat, I said. You did it before you had any reason to. You did it for a stranger you'd pulled out of the water in the dark, and I stopped again. I would like, I said, to spend a very long time being worthy of that. She was quiet. The fire spoke for a while between us, the snap and settle of it, familiar and warm. The large wolf got up from his place by the hearth and came and sat beside my chair, and then lay down across my feet with the firm authority of an animal who has decided something and sees no reason to discuss it. Saoirse watched this. The corner of her mouth moved, the small, contained way she had of showing things she might otherwise have kept private. All right, she said, the same 2 words she had said on the harbor path when I told her I was carrying her. The same flat simplicity, the same absolute sufficiency. All right, I said. We spent 4 more days in Thavern while her shoulder mended. 4 days that were, by any external measure, full of the business of kingdoms. My counsel came and went with messages and demands, and the urgent logistics of the wartime pact I had come to negotiate, which proceeded without my presence in the council hall and to everyone's apparent satisfaction, since I had good men around me who knew what I wanted and could be trusted to get it. The faction members who had arranged the ambush were taken north under guard. The archer from the breakwater, the one who had fired, declined to say who had given the order, and the man in my court who had sold the route found my judgment waiting for him when my counsel returned. I was not, in those 4 days, much occupied with any of it. I sat in the harbor keep and watched the coastal wolves come and go, and I watched Saoirse mend with the same quiet stubbornness she brought to everything. And I learned the names she hadn't given the wolves because she'd never thought they needed naming. And I told her things about Veldris that no one in a court had ever asked to know. The way the northern light looked in the week before the great frost, the sound the hold made in a sea wind. The fact that the training grounds had a colony of small gray birds that had lived in the rafters for so long that the trainees had stopped noticing them, and the birds had stopped noticing the trainees. She listened. She asked questions with the direct simplicity of someone who had no interest in performing ignorance and no interest in performing sophistication either. And she showed me, when I asked, the ledger she kept for the harbor, every vessel that had passed through in the last 8 years, the names of the families along the coast who used the keep's supplies in the winter, the count of the pups the harbor wolves had raised in the last 3 seasons. She had been keeping records of the wolves for years. She had been noting their patterns, their territories, the changes in the pack structure over time, with a precision that would have been remarkable in a trained scholar. She had done it because it seemed like the kind of thing that should be recorded, and because no one else was doing it, and because the wolves were her harbor and she intended to understand them. I read those records for an hour on the 3rd day, and said nothing for a long time afterward. What, she said. You have been doing this alone for 8 years, I said. Yes, without anyone asking you to. Who would ask me? She said. It was not self-pity. It was simply the arithmetic of her life, the harbor girl, the disgraced father's daughter, the one the coastal council had long since stopped seeing. No one asks the harbor keep for scholarship. No one asks the woman the pack has quietly chosen to explain what she has been recording for the better part of a decade. The harbor wolves of Thavern had been waiting 300 years for this. I was beginning to understand that they had chosen well. On the morning of the 5th day, I brought my counsel to the keep. This was not customary. A king does not conduct the business of recognition in a saltstone harbor keep with a sea fog outside and wolves on the floor. There are halls for this. There are ceremonies. My council knew all of them very well, and I could see in the faces of the three most senior men, Aldrich, Peven, Korath, each of them steady and trustworthy and possessed of strong opinions about protocol, the careful effort not to comment on the surroundings. Saoirse sat in her chair by the fire. Her arm was still bandaged. Her hair was still the salt and fog combination that was apparently its natural state, and she was watching my counsel with the same level attention she turned on everything. She had asked me the night before what this meant, the formal arrival of the Northern Court in her harbor keep, and I had told her plainly, because plain was the only language she trusted. This is the recognition, I had said. This is the naming. And she had said, in the characteristic way, all right, and gone back to her mending. I had loved her in that moment, with a completeness I could not have mapped with either language or reason. Aldrich read the formal declaration. He had written it himself, and he had written it well, the finding of the mate mark, the confirmation of the coastal wolves' choosing, the 300 years of the harbor packs waiting brought to its resolution. He read it in the old form, the one used when the bond was not a political arrangement but a destined one, and his voice was steady and without ceremony's emptiness. Saoirse listened. The wolves listened. The large one had come to stand beside her chair, and the others ranged themselves around the room with the same orderly calm they brought to everything. When Aldrich finished, I stood and crossed to her chair, and I held out my hand not to take hers but to offer. She looked at the hand for a moment. Then she put hers in it, and I felt the mark on my palm meet the mark on hers, and the warmth of it was not dramatic. It was simply complete. Saoirse of Thavern, I said, you are the Lunar of Veldris. The harbor wolves of Thavern's coast are confirmed as your pack to lead. The keep stays in your family's name, held in trust, and the families of this coast who depend on it will find it better provision than they have had reason to expect. I paused. And you are mine as I am yours, and that is the most important thing on the list. The council did not bow. That was not their custom, and I had not asked it. But Aldrich, who had known me since I was 12 years old, and who had a dignity that nothing in 17 years had ever dented, looked at Saoirse with an expression I had not seen him wear in a very long time, and it was something close to relief. She looked at me. You remembered the families, she said. It was in your ledger, I said. I read the ledger. The corner of her mouth moved again. The man who had sold the route, the faction member I had known since I was 12, faced his accounting in Veldris 3 weeks later, before the full court. I had spent 17 years being told what a king should feel about betrayal, and I had the full range of what he deserved, and I administered it without anger and without satisfaction, and with the total steadiness of a man who is done being surprised by the shape that loyalty can take. Saoirse stood at my left side during this, because she had insisted on being present, and I had long since understood that insisting otherwise was an exercise in losing an argument. She stood straight, her shoulder healed enough that she no longer favored it, and she watched the proceedings with the level attention she brought to everything. And when it was finished, she said nothing about it, which was the most useful thing anyone in the room could have done. The coastal wolves came north with her. 40 of them, resettling into the training grounds and the outer ward with the calm authority of animals who had been waiting for exactly this, and saw no reason to make a fuss about it now that it had arrived. The trainees, I was told, were startled for approximately 2 days, and then began competing for the large one's attention with offerings of dried meat, which Saoirse found unreasonably amusing. The harbor keep was provisioned and staffed, and its records transferred to the Veldris archive, where Saoirse's 8 years of Wolf Watch documentation caused the court scholar to use language I will not reproduce here, in what appeared to be the extremity of professional envy. She learned the shape of Veldris, steadily and without rush, the way she had learned everything, by paying attention and recording what she found. She had opinions about the training grounds that improved them. She had observations about the court's supply arrangements that my steward implemented within a fortnight and refused to admit had come from a source outside the professional class. She fed the gray birds in the rafters of the training hall, which I had never once done, and within a month they had stopped flying to the far end whenever I walked through. She was made for this, not in the sense that I had ever thought a person could be made for the specific weight and difficulty of a king's court. I had stopped believing in that kind of simplicity a long time ago. but in the sense that every quality in her that the harbor had built, the steadiness, the practicality, the complete absence of performance, the willingness to simply solve the problem in front of her without needing anyone to notice, those qualities did not disappear when she came north. They became, in the new context, something the court had been without for a very long time and did not know how to name. She named it herself, eventually, in the dry way she had. "You needed someone who would tell you when the plan was wrong," she said. "Yes," I said. "And no one was doing that." "Aldrich was trying," I said, "but he's too fond of me to push hard enough." She considered this. "I'm fond of you," she said. "I'll still push." "I know," I said. "That's the whole point." The wartime pact was concluded without incident. The faction's influence in the Northern Court collapsed with the accountability of its senior member and the full knowledge, now public, that their last operation had cost them not only their objective, but the Alpha King's awareness of every one of their connections. The pact that I had nearly died crossing the sea to negotiate held firm through the 2 years of border conflict that followed and was cited, when the conflict resolved, as the thing that had made resolution possible. I am not telling you this to speak of pacts and courts and the logistics of northern kingdoms. I am telling you because it matters to me that the story she stepped into, the arrow and the harbor path, the 40 wolves rising off the breakwater, the mark burning into my palm in the sea fog, was not in the end a story about a moment. It was a story about everything the moment opened. She had 3 wolves who slept in our rooms, which was non-negotiable as far as the wolves were concerned, and the large one had appointed himself her shadow in the way that only the harbor wolves could do it, with the absolute conviction of an animal who has waited 3 centuries and sees no reason to be understated about having arrived. She went on keeping records. The Veldris Wolf Archive is, in large part, her work, a systematic accounting of the northern pacts that no previous court had thought to produce, which has now been in use for 11 years, and which wolf scholars come from a considerable distance to consult. She mended still. It was something she found clarifying, she said, the work of the hands and the quiet of it. She had the harbor keep's chair brought north eventually, the old one, salt-scored and worn at the arms, and it sat by the fire in the inner room, and that is where I most often found her in the evenings, the large wolf at her feet and the mending in her hands, and the firelight doing what firelight does to a face you have been grateful for every day for 11 years. I had been told before all of this that the fated bond was a destined thing, inevitable, sealed, written somewhere in the old patterns before either person involved had any say. I had been told this by court scholars and by the keepers of the Moontide lore and by my father, who said it with the conviction of a man who had experienced it himself. I had carried this all my life, and I had sat before woman after woman my counsel brought me, and the bond had not come, and I had begun to think that perhaps destined was a word that described something that happened to other people. Then a woman I did not know crouched at the edge of a harbor in the dark with a salvage lantern, looked at a bleeding stranger in the shallows and said, "Come out of the water." Then she stepped into an arrow I did not see coming, and my palm burned, and 40 coastal wolves came off the breakwater, and the 300 years the harbor pack had been keeping ended in a breath. She was not made for me in the way of an instrument made for a purpose. She was not made small, or made compliant, or made to fill the specific shape of what a king required. She was made, as it turned out, for everything. For a harbor's salt and fog, for the records no one else kept, for the wolves who had been waiting for her since before her name existed, for the practical solving of whatever problem stood in front of her. Whether it was a wound in a man's ribs, or an arrow in flight, or an archive that needed building, or a court that needed someone who would not be impressed by it. I was the last problem on that list that she solved. I don't say this with any pride, it is simply the accurate accounting of the thing. She had been solving the harbor for years before I arrived, and she solved it with the same hands she used to close my wound and the same eyes she used to step into the arrow's path. And the only thing that changed when I came into it was that she had one more problem, and it turned out to be, finally, a manageable one. She would say it differently. She says most things differently than I say them. She says, "You came out of the water and then you stayed." I did, I will.